All right, good morning, everyone. Thank you for attending our session on building a more resilient transportation infrastructure. I'm Jamie Shern, the Environmental Advisor to the Secretary of Transportation. I have with me Dr. Barbara Dahl. She's the Extension Assistant Professor and Extension Specialist with North Carolina State University, and Mr. Pelen, the Attache for Infrastructure and Water Management, Embassy of the Kingdom of the Netherlands. Barbara and Jan have been visiting multiple locations in North Carolina over the last few days. They've been looking to try to understand some of the specific needs of our state. And together we're working hand in hand to plan and implement new designs and strategies to help communities reduce the effects of these storm events. So I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Barbara Dahl, and again, she is coming to us from North Carolina State University Biological and Agricultural Engineering Department. Barbara?
Great, it's good to be here, and my topic I have is how do we improve our resilience to flooding, and hopefully we have some interaction time at the end of this. So I don't have all the answers. I think that's what we're trying to kind of get at. What are some of the possibilities of things we can do, and looking outside of North Carolina. That's why we have John here today. So we'll hopefully learn a lot. We're learning a lot from what he's sharing with us about how they do things in the Netherlands. What I do know is flooding does have quite a cost. My work is with communities. My career has been in ecological restoration, but the needs of flooding since the 90s, since Floyd, and how many storms we've had, just continues to be this repeat that it's an area that I have just branched my work into because of knowing about river systems and hydrology, that helping communities with flooding was something kind of feel like I had to go do. We have nationally about 85 deaths a year. That's the 30-year average. That's the yellow bars, second only to heat deaths for natural disasters. But you can see the 2017 is the red bar in that graph at the bottom, and we're starting to exceed that, over 114 recorded for 2017. 90% of U.S. natural disasters result from flooding. 41, and there's a new study that came out, some researchers from the United States and overseas said there were 41 million residents, about 13% of our entire population, at risk from flooding, which was 3 times greater than what the FEMA regulatory 100-year floodplain map shows. So it's even a lot of people at risk that don't realize they're at risk. And working with communities is really essential, especially my program also has North Carolina Sea Grant that I work with in addition to Bio and Ag. And so Eastern North Carolina is the focus of a lot of the work we're doing. And we have a lot of small towns there, less than 10,000 population, other than Wilmington and Moorhead. Elizabeth City, most of the towns are under 10,000 population. These towns don't have the capacity, whether it's funding or even any staffing. They don't have engineers in a lot of these towns on their staff to work on these topics, to model, to make decisions. And even if they have funding, they often don't know how to frame a scope of work for a hydrology or a hydraulic study to get at some of the questions they have their needs. So they really need that modeling and data, cost analysis to base their decisions on. So I find them kind of really just kind of standing there going, what do we do next? They really don't know which way to go. So we've been helping a lot of communities. I want to talk a little bit about some work we completed up in Windsor at NC State, and then some ongoing work we're doing in the Neuse River Basin that's funded by DOT that's in progress. So Windsor is located up here in the Kashai River Basin here. And then here we got the Neuse River Basin. A lot of our work is focused in Goldsboro, Kinston, Smithfield, and also with Carteret County. So just to kind of quickly tell you about the efforts we did in Windsor, we want to kind of look at why does it flood and what, if anything, can we do about it. This project is much more. I'm just going to show you a few slides on it. So we evaluated the causes of flooding, and we had to deal a lot with the perceptions of things that they thought exacerbated flooding. This was a big part of our work. So we did a lot of modeling, developed cost estimates, and potential mitigation options. We thought, what could be done? What's some scenarios? We looked at increasing bridge spans to give more capacity. We looked at the potential to control drainage in the watershed on ag and timber properties, a very rural watershed. We looked at adding levees. We looked at adding water storage through impoundments in the watershed as well. So there's the Kashai River Basin's about 180 square miles. The population of Windsor down there at the very bottom end, just before it goes in the Roanoke River, is under 4,000. The whole county is just over 20,000 people. So we did a lot of the modeling using land use information, hydraulics, hydrology, and water balance models, using the standards for today of what models should be used for this. And we looked at, here in the town of Windsor, the floodplain we noticed was very wide, over 2,000 feet. This is the town. The river's coming down this way, heading to Roanoke. And the bridge opening was only about 150 feet. And this was something they've been pointing their fingers at a lot, saying, this is causing the flooding. This is making it worse. Water can't get out. And so we modeled increasing the bridge span. We actually modeled taking out this entire landmass here of Old Bertie. What happens? What's the benefit? And we found less than a foot of elevation difference in a Matthews scale storm event for them. Why? It's because of the backwater of the Roanoke River. At that point, everything's so flat, the water can't get out. With that, once you're at a 100-year water storm or above, even though the bridge is bigger, the water's just going to hit a wall of water and sit there. So that was pretty depressing for them, but it's very effective in moving them away from something, kind of complaining, asking for help is something that's not going to get them what they need. It's not going to benefit them. We also looked at levees, 2 levees. We had a limit on how high those levees could go because of the surrounding topography. But what we found is they would only help up to a Hurricane Julia, Tropical Storm Julia. Once you got Matthew or above, they were going to overtop anyway. They were not going to help. And so we also looked in the watershed at potential storage with reservoirs that were dry detention that wouldn't hold any water until about a 25-year storm, but would help taper off peak flows in the watershed. And we found limited help from those. And we looked at all the methods individually and in combination to see how far could we get the water level down below that red threshold line there at the top, at where damages really start to occur in the town. And we found it was pretty tough, even with all these things combined, which were millions of dollars. And we looked at cost of implementing these things, individually, combination, and what the benefit was, how many structures were not destroyed, and what was the value. And we found the cost far outweighed the value from a one-time storm like Matthew. Now, FEMA's currently working on hopefully looking at this over a 30 and 50-year period to see if any of these options, the more reasonable ones, could work. But the bottom line message that the Windsor and the Bertie County got was we've got to keep moving the vulnerable people and houses and structures out of the floodplain. This is really priority. None of these other things are going to really save the day for us. There's no silver bullet. So this kind of segued into our Neuse River project, again, looking at sources and nature of flooding and what kind of mitigation options were there, and putting them into modeling those, looking at cost of those, working with DOT, working with emergency management. How can we help? Again, the first thing we did was hold workshops in Smithfield, Goldsboro, and Kinston back in April, but these were to targeted stakeholders of emergency managers, public works, the mayor, engineers, planners, and to get the relevant information. So what do we not know? Here's everything the emergency management put together. what else, what are we missing? And what are the real concerns by you in this community? And from that, we developed a detailed scope of work. In this case, we didn't have to develop a watershed model for the Neuse because emergency management just completed that. Actually, AECOM did models for the Neuse, Tar, and Lumber rivers, just recently updated all those. So we had a brand new model to work with for this. So I'm going to kind of take you through these. One of the things we found very important to the communities is early warning. When these floods come, a lot of times the town will be divided into 2 or even 3 sections. So if they know in advance, they can position utility people, they can position emergency responders, so they can get to the people that are there. They have the resources positioned because they know they're going to be separated across this. So we're looking at taking gauge information from USGS emergency management along the rivers and adding that into the Fireman tool. And what we found out is emergency management actually already had a road operation in Fireman that's not visible. And being able to create alerts for road closures that could be in the Thames mapping and the READY NCDOT org app that people can access. And that would hopefully push notifications out to those county people, the town people, emergency responders, etc. They go, this road's getting close to being closed. We need to be prepared for that. And we're also looking at early warning for we had specific roads that were identified, and the evacuation routes, of course, are important. And as you know, some of the primary routes were closed, so even secondary evacuation routes are going to be important in this as well. So this is a lot of detailed work our engineering team at NC State is doing to look at elevations of the bridge, the surrounding area. They take the models, the effective models from emergency management, kind of figure out where that low point, where the flooding, how it occurs, and relate that back to the gauge data information to see how can we correlate information at the gauge. Really? That went quick. Okay. One of the things also, we know that flash flooding is really a problem in some of these communities. So we're looking at all the river crossings. Here's an example in Kinston, the Adkin branch. It has flash flooding before the river backs up. So we're looking at all the crossings to determine which, if they were going to repair, elevate one above to give good access because a school, a hospital, or it's causing a restriction, which crossing would be the most sensible one for them to target first, second, and third. That's another thing we're working on. And we're also going to model the worst case scenarios, more development in the watershed combined with some of the worst rainfall. Okay, we saw some bad stuff in Florence, but what if that happened, hit the upper part of the basin? And what kind of rainfall, what kind of flow does that mean? And what's that preparing for? How bad can it be? So we don't just look at, okay, this has happened, but can it be worse than that? Another thing we're doing is looking at floodplain ordinances and to see how their ordinances can be improved. A good example of that is Louisville, Kentucky. They had their 1997 flood, 40,000 homes damaged. And one of the things they did is said, you know, the highest and best use of floodplains is for flood water. So they started removing structures out of that, and they rewrote their floodplain ordinance, which became a model. So how can we learn from communities like that? We have to work on how we communicate the risk of flooding. That's Dr. Brian Bledsoe. He wrote an article in the Washington Post about this. And he said, okay, so we have that 100-year floodplain. What does that mean to people? Well, if we look at FEMA maps, it says you got the floodway, nothing can go there, but you got the flood fringe, so some encroachment can occur. What does that mean? Well, any given year, that structure within that 100-year floodplain edge there can have a 1% chance of being flooded. So people, oh, that's not too bad, 1%. But they think, we get the storm, I've got another 100 years. No, that 1% renews itself each year. But let's look at it across a 30-year mortgage time. Then you're looking at 26% chance that structure will be flooded. So that's typical mortgage time. That's not a very good statistic. I'm not liking that risk. So I think Jan is going to talk more about how they've addressed risk. I won't go into that. Repetitive loss structures, we've got to work on moving these. A study that looked at 78 to 2013 found that 25% of all claims were on repetitive loss, but they're only 1.3% of the policies. Doesn't make sense. We've got to deal with these structures, moving them out. In North Carolina, because of inland flooding, some of our counties are in that high red level of repetitive loss. Now, we're seeing that in the news. If you look at that, you'll see those darker colors there on the map. I want to just take a couple minutes, if Jamie doesn't yank me off the stage here, to tell you about one case study project that I think could be a good example. A colleague of mine, Chuck Flink, is actually a greenway planner and landscape architect. But as you know, greenways follow our rivers. And he has done a lot in the past 30 years of his career working with communities on greenways that have folded into flooding and river management. And he's got some really great projects. One was in Grand Forks, North Dakota in 1997. This is a fairly small city, 57,000. They had the flood, highest flood of record since 1826. And if that wasn't enough, they had a fire at the same time. So they had 11 buildings on fire and 16 apartment units. So this was pretty devastating. That's the Herald, their newspaper, that was burned and flooded at the same time. So we think flooding's bad. So what was the recovery? I think we can learn from this. They did FEMA buyout of repetitive loss, including buildings. 50 residential homes were moved in one community. They built a protective, flexible flood wall and levee system. They reimagined their downtown, and they implemented this 2,200-acre greenway plan with 20 miles of trails that provided the area for water, a place for water and a place for people. They designated that. And they programmed their greenway for activity. They didn't just build it. They said, we're going to have targeted activities there. So this map here shows you that 20 miles of trail, 2,200 acres. They have a levee and a flexible flood wall there. This is that area after. I'm going to quickly roll through these because I'm running out of time. They have a monument there to mark the flood stages. You can see the 1997 flood at the top of that. Cabela's actually said, we want to be on this greenway. They built a facility there, and they programmed activity. They had a greenway day with over 50,000 people attended this event. They have a flotilla of boaters on the river. They have tremendous use of this area. A lot of that 2,200 acres is, though, just park-like setting that's available for water storage. They use it, you know, it's North Dakota. They get a lot of snow, so they use it in winter. And they've looked at some of the revenue of all these different activities, both indirect and direct, and seeing that they're getting, you know, somewhere between $10 and $16 million of annual revenue benefit. It's a desirable, it becomes a desirable place to be. It's been featured in a lot of publications. It's a really well-renowned project, but it does flood in that area. And so here's those flexible flood walls that have to be put in place. 2 to 3 times they've had water reaching near the 1997 level. So when it floods, that bridge is closed. So they have to be prepared for that, and they have to have walls in place. But designating that place for people, place for water. So there's one of those flood events. I have some take-home points, but we can skip those if we need to move on. You give me the word, Jamie.
Let's wrap it up and leave a little bit of time for questions and answers, and maybe we can revisit that.
Okay, yeah, this may come in the questions. All right. No problem. I assume Jan's right after this. Okay. I'm not good with the apple, so I'm going to get off the
See if I can get this to work. In the meanwhile, because Jamie is keeping the timing, welcome, I'm Jan. First of all, thank you for having me. I work for the Dutch Embassy, where I represent the Dutch DOT. My main job is advising states, communities, or federal colleagues on climate resilience and urban planning. And actually, I met Barbara and some of your colleagues this week to talk about resilience. And they asked me to talk about resilience for infrastructure, and I'm going to talk about it, but I'm going to make a small detour to water management, and you'll see why. Just for those people who never visited the Netherlands, small northwestern European country, we're with 17 million people, in a country the size of roughly 1/3 of the state of North Carolina. You might find it a tad busy. We are we're small, but we are one of the top 20 global economies. If you ever flew to Europe, there's a big chance you flew through Amsterdam, which is one of the biggest airports. We have the port of Rotterdam, which is the biggest port outside of China. We proudly call it the gateway to Europe. And we also, the drain of northwestern Europe. We have 3 big rivers, the Rhine, the Meuse, and the Scheldt, all flowing into our delta. That's our country. We are a pretty urban country. Most of the people live in cities, but they're relatively small, not as the biggest cities like 800,000 people. And there's still a lot of green space, but used for agriculture, for recreational green, and water. There's a lot of water. Because we're so small and we have an awful lot of water, and actually a big part of my country is below sea level, we created a strong planning culture with focus on resilience, efficiency, and quality, because we have a little land, as one of the speakers yesterday said, they don't make it anymore. So we have to be very, effective with it, and that's the mission of my department. Our mission is basically, summarized: keep the country competitive, keep it attractive, keep it safe and accessible. Dutch infrastructure. We have an executive agency that actually owns and operates our highway system, which is size and waterways. Our highways are just a small part of our paved roads. They're actually not more than 3% of all paved roads, but they handle a disproportionately amount of the traffic because the secondary system actually is, designed to feed to the highways. The fact that it's very dense, it complicates the fact, we can't really expand a lot because there's not much room, because there's development on both sides. And because we're so dependable on our highways to function, safety, traffic safety of course, but also reliability are our primary targets. We do accept the fact that we have congestion, we don't like it, but we're now focusing on, at least it's to be reliable. So that if you're going into rush hour, your traffic, you can have a decent estimate of your traffic time. So we're focusing on reducing the hindrance by building activity and maintenance and making it, at least people know what to expect. We were talking finance and PPP yesterday. PPP is basically our standard mode of procedure. Every new project is a DBFM project. We strike administrative deals, so the national government and local government create a deal and basically a contract on who's going to pay for what. And we also involve, for example, developers who actually will benefit from a infrastructural improvement. They have to chip in. Also, the NGOs who do the ecological part, for example, or Environmental Defense Fund, they're usually part of that conversation too. They don't sue us if we agree that we will adhere to certain ecological goals. This is just a short overview of my country and our highway system. This is actually the map for our renovation project this year. It's, like I said, it's 930 miles. It's include a lot of dynamic traffic management because we use it a lot. And there's a lot of exchange with the secondary roads. And what actually makes our system so special is we have an awful lot of specials. A lot of culverts, tunnels, aqueduct, bridges, you name it. This is actually a good picture that basically sums our situation up. We have the highways, we have the train, we have an aqueduct, and as you can see, does this have it? Yeah. And as you can see, the highway goes underneath the water. And that's actually why we're going to take the detour to water management. my country is below sea level, and the dark blue is actually below sea level, and as you can probably guess, 60% of our people live below sea level. 60% of our GDP below sea level. So we take water management pretty darn serious. Somebody once said, if we don't take it serious, we're going to move to Germany. And nobody wants that. We love our neighbors. Basically what we always say, we have 800 years of experience in water management. When I came to the US, you guys talk a lot about national security. We use basically the same terms if we talk about water management. That's national security to us. And we're actually pretty darn good at it. Like to brag. We created what we say the safest delta in the world. We created a system of levees and coastal defense and riverine defense systems that defend our country to extreme events with a safety standard of once in a 1250-year event, up to 1 to 10,000. And the difference in level is all dependent on cost benefit. So you see, for example, here, the red areas have the 1 in 10,000 year protection standard. That's where the most people and the most economy activities are. So, this is what we're famous for. This is our fortress. We built this in the 50s and we finished in the 90s. This is our, while you were doing the Apollo project, we were doing this. This is what we're famous for, concrete. This is where the engineers in the room get really excited about. So this is for you guys and girls. But we're doing so much more because we find out we can't engineer your way out of everything. We also try to not just make just a nice engineering project, we always try to create additional value. This is actually a reinforcement of the coast. Our engineer said we need a big wall. The problem is that this coastal town is depending on its tourism for the beach. So they didn't like the idea of a big wall. So we actually decided to extend the beach, create a better beach, splurge on design and make a lower but broader wall, and have a renowned architect really make a nice boulevard. And actually for something, and the end result is that a project that everybody dreaded because it would kill tourism actually now improved tourism. We use the force of nature to work with us. We have a lot of sandy coast, we need to do a lot of beach nourishment. Instead of dredging, we just dredged an awful lot of sand on one specific location, and we're now using the current and the wind to disperse the sand along the coast. This is a pilot. We started in 2013, and the sand is actually getting where it should be. Additional value. There's a lot of new tourism. Kite surfers love this place. We also look for water storage in cities. This is actually a parking garage that doubles as a water storage. I have to say, because you're all thinking, the cars and the water are in separate spaces. We work a lot actually for years with Americans. We've been working with New Orleans. They have an urban water plan. This is the basic principle of the urban water plan. We advise them about that. We worked with Norfolk on new projects to get federal money for the more resilient waterfront. We worked in New York after Sandy. We advised them for a Dutch design competition where basically New York pulled all international, the brightest engineers and designers to create ideas for a better, more resilient New York. But in the meanwhile, our own country is changing. Climate change presents a new rounds of challenges, and there are an awful lot. We can handle sea level rise, we've worked with that, and a little bit more water in the rivers, that's okay. But all of a sudden we saw this decrease in the river discharge. Subsidence is actually becoming a problem. Salt intrusion, more intense rainfall, we have a pretty moderate climate. Spatial development, and these things, I know that in the US that not everybody agrees, on this, and they said, well, you know, that's a long-term thing, but it's not a long-term thing for us. This is the early 90s. This is a highway, not a surfway. And this is not below sea level. This is actually on the elevated part. Urban flooding. They say, you know, flood rises all ships. I don't know what that means for public transportation. This is actually this summer. We had the driest summer ever. This is the river that basically caused the flood where the surfer was using the highway. This year, our archaeologists had a field day because the water in our rivers was never so low. We found stuff from the Roman area that we never saw. So these challenges are acute. They're now and they're changing. And we are actually have to deal with what is the new normal? And I actually heard today somebody say, we don't like uncertainty. No, we don't either. So we actually established that, you know, we are going to reach some tipping points. We don't know where the future is changing, but we know it's changing. And we could reach some tipping points, you know, after that point. The way we handle stuff, hey, we manage our country and create a safe environment, might not be feasible again. So we created a framework to deal with this uncertainty of what the effects of climate change will be and when do they occur. So we created a framework that will give us the flexibility to handle these new situations. One of the biggest changes is the risk. We talked about risk an awful lot the last few days, and we basically changed our risk. So we are used the same, like we use an event-based system, a 1 in a 100-year event, a 1 in 500-year event. But that number doesn't say anything anymore if a 1 in 500-year event happens twice a week. So we dropped the whole system approach and the event approach. We're now going to perceive risk on a personal basis. So we're going to try to reduce the risk. If the policy fails, nobody dies, or the chance that somebody dies is very limited. So that's just, I can't stress this enough, that's a completely new way to think about things. Because we always relied on our coastal defense system or riverine defense system. Now we have all these new challenges and we accept the fact that our policy is going to fail. We create specific programs to deal with new riverine flooding, sea level rise. But if we're going to toy with the idea that the policy is going to fail, or that, like, urban cloudbursts are going to, we can't, the levee won't help you with an urban cloudburst. So how do we deal with that? And we actually, in the framework that we made, we decided, okay, all the other, the water management community knows what they have to do. But we also have to engage all the other communities, the transport, we call the dry infrastructure people, the energy folks. They have to look at their networks and how to see how resilient they are. So, and that's also what we're doing literally right now. We're doing a stress test for all our infrastructure. This is actually what some of my colleagues presented this year at RISE in Denver. We're doing a stress test and we're looking at all the possible effects on our highways. We have a lot of specials, for example, all the tunnels we have, how will they flood, or do we have 22 public swimming pools on the road? We had more than 800 bridges in our highways. Most of them are steel constructions. They will extend. Can you open and close a bridge when it's extending? That kind of stuff. So we're basically making an inventory of all the new risks and what they can mean for our highway system. And that's what we're here now. We're doing a vulnerability assessment. How vulnerable is our system to the various kind of risks? And then this next step is, if our system is compromised, how bad is it? Is it really bad if we have, like, specific portion of the road, if it floods for a day, is that so bad? What's the effect? You know, does anybody die from it? Is the economic damage high or not? So we're in the process of figuring out a system, how vulnerable we are, what's the damage if something occurs, and you know, what can you do to mitigate the situation? Then we're going to look at, like, we can mitigate the situation, but at what cost? And is it feasible to do so? We're going to look at basically everything. We're going to look at objects, but also the use of materials. Maybe you can use different materials and the problem is solved. The system, if a certain section of a highway floods, is that a bad thing? Do we have to heighten it, or can we do a detour? And then we have to incorporate all of this into a program, you know, to start fixing stuff. Can we do it, you know, with ordinary maintenance in a couple of years, renovation projects? Do we have to do like a whole new program to beef up our highway system? We have to create new guidelines for projects. Basically, we're creating a pathway for each segment that will have an issue, and I'll come back to the pathway situation. And we will look for added value. We're actually doing this stress test, but we're also doing already pilots. We know that certain sections will flood. So, for example, we have a road, and we know it floods with, you know, when there's a lot of rain, a specific river will flood the road. There's a culvert, but it's not big enough. So what we did, we put in a much bigger culvert, but we blended the costs. We didn't use just the cost for renovation. We used also some money from the ecological fund, because this big culvert is designed to be a passage for animals while it's not flooded. So, and this is actually one of the tools we created to deal with uncertainty, an adaptation pathway. It shows the possible sequence of decisions to achieve an objective. So you have a certain problem, and you have all these kind of solutions that, you know, might help you. So, but what's a good solution? For example, action A will help you no matter what happens in the next 50 years. You know, a lot of climate change, a little bit. Action D might do the same, but is more expensive. Action B is very cheap, it won't help you a lot. And there are actually, if we do this inventory, we see that there are tipping points. So like I said, action B will help us, but it will only probably help us in low scenarios or the next 10 years. After that, we might have to switch to a different solution. For example, C, but action C will only help us for the next 30 years, not the next 50 years. So, and putting all the solutions next together and see how they interact with each other actually helps us make smart investment decisions and prevent locking. And this is actually the entire system as we designed it, and we're actually testing if this works, and it works. And you can see that, like, it's also very important, especially for those people who make decisions or politicians. Like, there are going to be certain events, like a trigger. For example, Florence, it's going to be a trigger for new action. And then there's the point, like, how many time do you have before the trigger event, and the point you have to make a decision what you're going to do. For example, when does the available funding stop? So then the question is, that's all very nice, Jan, but how does this relate to North Carolina? This is not the Netherlands, this is not New York, as somebody said. This might be rural North Carolina. Well, my idea is, if I talk with DOT, North Carolina, you guys, your interstates and your infrastructure was pretty much hammered by these flood events. You could actually use the momentum of Florence, and I can tell you that based on our experience in the US, your momentum is 1 year. You have 1 year right now to start doing something if you want to beef up the resilience of your infrastructure. You have 1 year to come up with a plan or a pilot that will make it more resilient. You have to do an analysis. You have to determine what do you really want out of resilience? What is resilience? What do you find an acceptable risk? and how much you want to invest in that and how you can do that in a smart way. Like, can you use renovation budgets? Is there some federal relief money and stuff? So some of the questions that would come up is, what is the outcome you want to achieve? Do you want to prevent all North Carolina highways from flooding? Or do you just want to make sure that every city, no matter what happens, still has a route in or out, like Wilmington did and have not? Do you want, a lot of the people who died during Florence died on the road. Do you want to reduce the number of deaths during an event to 0? So what is the outcome you're going for? That really depends what you're focusing on. What are the risks you want to account for? Florence was a rain event. Some hurricanes you guys have are wind events. Do you want to take that risk into account or what? So you really have to think about that as well. And then which effects are you allowed to involve in a cost-benefit analysis? Like the Dutch, everything is cost-benefit analysis based. So, but we can actually also, like I said, availability of roads is big for us because we're a country with a lot of logistics and stuff. So for us, for example, it would be key to have Interstate 95 available for traffic at all times. And we would actually use that as a cost-benefit analysis, but then as a positive for that. But I don't know, how your system actually, what can you include in the cost-benefit analysis and what not. And you should really think about that, because that really makes your business case. And then the most important question actually to start, how much time do you have? Well, I think, in my experience in the US, you have a year. What is the budget you have readily available, and what is the political capital you can use to at least kickstart something that, might... The analysis we did is something, it will take us at least 2 years just to do the analysis. But we have a system that's open for that. That's just ongoing concern. For you guys, it's much more the question like, what is the budget, the capital, the political willingness to start doing something that actually will lead to tangible results that might lead to more budget, more space, and more time for an analysis, making you and thinking about a more resilient North Carolina infrastructure. And I hope that this is actually the teaser that I hope you start a discussion about that and think about it. Like I said, you have 1 year. That's it. Oh, and I have 2 minutes left. Which is really big for me.
Thank you, Jan. I just wanted to open up the floor for any questions for Jan or Dr. Dahl. Be happy to answer those at this time. Well, it's okay.
So Jan, you talked a lot about the highway network and the Netherlands. What about rail? Because we have a pretty extensive rail network. You now have rail lines which are only for freight. So is that also part of your resilience analysis?
Yeah, yes, it is, but it's a different organization. So actually, for us, DO2 is responsible for all modes of transportation, but the executive agency just does the highways and the waterways, and then we have a different agency that does the railroad. But they too will have to do an analysis. I think they are a little bit in a better spot because a lot of the rail is elevated on embankments, but they will go through the same loop, and actually we'll have to bring together the results because, like you saw in one of the pictures, a couple of the pictures, highway and rail are often in the same spot. So if our highway and our rail will probably be, compromised by the same events. If there's a flood, then both will flood. So especially with the larger projects, we will probably have to team up and also blend money to come up with solutions, because otherwise you will have a solution from the highway that will basically only make a problem for the rail worse.
Okay.
John, you talked quite a bit about the stress test. Was there a public policy trigger that made that happen? I mean, was there an event that actually led to the Netherlands taking on this analysis of the stress test?
The analysis is basically a policy outcome from the new Delta program. But I can tell you that, like, to be very honest, it was actually Katrina in New Orleans that really rattled the cage for us. We saw what happened if a western city floods, and Louisiana is pretty comparable to our country. Like, I feel right at home there. And basically our politicians asked the question, can this happen to us? So we did, the analysis, and the answer was like, well, we don't have hurricanes. Yes, this could happen to us, and the May and will be even bigger. And that actually started a lot of politicians to think about, like, okay, but how do we prevent this? And so that actually triggered a whole process of years, like, how are we going to deal with climate change and the uncertainty that comes with it? And then we created this framework I mentioned, and the framework basically said, okay, this is a framework, how we're going to do it from the water side, but we do know that, like, we can't solve it just by water management alone. And then they made a recommendation. So this is actually, the Delta program finished a year ago, and then they started doing the stress test.
The company I work for is actually Dutch owned, so I know a little bit about the company. It's actually very impressive.
Arcade.
So how you do your public engagement, public involvement? It's pretty extensive. Can you speak about that a little bit, your process?
It's pretty much the same experience as Barbara has with the communities. A lot of people, well, we are in the fortunate position that a lot of people understand that we have to do something about climate change. But for example, we actually did restructured our riverine protection, and we actually had to do eminent domain on a couple of locations, and people were furious because we have a levee, it works, just heighten the levee. And we don't want to lose our house because you need an additional flood zone. And we actually made a program for because we had to do like 30 projects. We actually made a very extensive discussion with the community. Okay guys, we're going to do some stuff that will hurt your community. People will not like it. But after that, we basically gave them the map and said, please help us draw a new situation that really works for your community. And we know we can't make everybody happy, but at least you should have ownership about this. And the whole ownership part is very important. We now have people, if you guys come and visit my country and want to see one of these Room for the River projects, you won't be talking to a government official, at least not the national government. It's our project. But we gave the ownership of a lot of it to local communities. So the spokesperson for the project is a local mayor, or the local president of the bird watching movement, or the farmers, So we really focused on local ownership because the country is so small, you can't swing a cat around or you're hitting somebody. You're hitting somebody's interest. And for example, we strive, we're not just doing flood defense. There always had to be an added value, and that's not just from the cost-benefit analysis, it's also for public acceptance. So people have to, if we're done, people must have the feeling that they're heard and that they're getting better, something better back. That's it.
And I'll have Dr. Dahl wrap it up for us. I wanted her to elaborate a little bit on our efforts going on in the Highway 70 corridor and the new space, and some of the work that you're doing in partnership with us, and establishing some of the monitoring stations and allowing people to at least be able to predict when they might be flooded and so forth. Could you elaborate on that?
Right, what I had mentioned, the NC-FIMIN tool, NCFIMIN. How many of you have gone on that? If you haven't, I encourage you to visit that. And you know, we have our FRIS site, the flood, I can't even remember the acronym now, but even Jan was saying they don't have anything like that. North Carolina has really taken it to the next level with having that real-time information of what flow is at, and they have done modeling of the rivers, and they know how when the flow is at one level in the river, what's the inundation, so, and then what structures are flooded and how high that water is on those structures, because emergency management also has the geodetic survey there, so they go out, record high water marks so they can really get good resolution. They work closely during events with the Southeast River forecast, so they can say, this is where it's coming, and they give alerts. And so if you go on that real-time information during storms is very valuable to, you know, anyone interested, which is a lot of people in North Carolina, unfortunately, now. In fact, they got so many hits during Florence and other storms, they had a lot of people working to keep their system up and running because the data information was so demanding. They were worried about losing accessibility to that. So that's the system. Fortunately, we learned that they had this already a routine in there that was kind of looking at road closures, because they worked closely with the other agencies, with DOT on kind of, DOT goes, what can we expect? So hopefully we can get that into the system where it goes out to individuals, and so they know that as well. Not, you know, we get that information more readily available. One thing I did want to mention from our discussion yesterday with Jan, I think a couple points that he made that really kind of sunk in with us is that the funding stream for dealing with water, whether it's drought, you know, because that will come too, or it's flooding, that we need to really get more organized on a steady stream of funding and kind of deal with, FEMA, we may not get all the money we need for certain projects to make them holistic, to really give people the buyout that they require to get out. So we're going to have to kind of work on what kind of funding system do we have. Maybe it's a North Carolina water management program that has some appropriation or steady stream of funding that would be able to do that. That's really necessary.
And I want to add to that, like you said, we don't have, you know, the way North Carolina has his digital open source system where citizens just can, you know, log in and see what's happening. And actually the whole system also even, you know, gives suggestion for mitigation measures and how and a cost-benefit ratio of them. I'm pretty blown away by that. And people will say like, okay, how does this relate to other locations in the country? And you know, you guys are in a good spot. You have an economy that's roaring. Let's be honest, Florence was bad, but it wasn't like the devastation we see, for example, in New Orleans. And you know that you're going to grow. Somebody told me you're going to basically add the state of Kansas to your population. You know, if you know that already and you have a growing, this is the point that you can start thinking about, okay, how do I create value and resilience, especially with the idea in mind that you're going to add 3 million people to the state of North Carolina.
Well, we're going to have to leave it there. It's about 11:40. Lunch will be served in about 5 minutes. And thank you, everybody, for attending. And look forward to the Secretary's comments and wrap up this afternoon. Thank you guys so much.